So in just under 10 minutes, a curfew, a mandatory curfew, will go into effect in Charlotte. Yet and still, you have hundreds of people out on the streets protesting. The mayor has signed this order for this mandatory curfew, but it does not appear, unless these people live very near, that they're going to make their way home and be off the streets by midnight. This is the third night of protests there. Last night they turned violent. Tonight they have not been so violent after the fatal shooting of Keith Lamont Scott. Let's talk about this, some of the legal angles, some of the police angles, and where we can expect to go from here. CNN senior legal analyst is Jeffrey Toobin. He joins us now, and Areva Martin, attorney and civil rights activist. Thank you for staying up with me. Jeffrey, you know, in the case of this shooting in Charlotte, where eyewitnesses and family members say one thing, police say another, and neither side trusts the other without the release of this video, how can this be solved?
Well, the video will be released at some point, and there has to be an investigation. I mean, there is not a lot. You know, there's a lot that's not known about there. How many witnesses were there? What are the ballistics? What does the ballistics evidence show? How? All of the investigating that needs to be done in a normal case has to be done here. I mean, ultimately the facts matter, and I think they should release the video now, but they certainly should continue doing the investigation, and then we'll know more about how this killing took place.
So the Scott family, as well as the mayor and other officials, Areva and Jeffrey, because I think I'm going to pose this to both of you, they viewed the videotape today. They said that there was no definitive visual evidence to determine whether he was holding or pointing a gun at the time of the shooting. Yet the police chief was on Fox this evening, and he said this. Listen.
There's a lot of other evidence that gives us a great deal of support and comfort that the version that you heard from us before is supported by the evidence and all the statements that we were able to gather. And the totality of the circumstances lead us to believe that that version is still very much accurate.
Okay, so he can't talk specifically about the evidence, but he says the evidence that we don't know about says that their original version, the version of the police officers, is accurate, Areva.
Yeah, I think that's the problem, Don, with the statement that we keep hearing from the police chief. He wants this community to trust him, and this is a community that has absolutely zero trust in the police, and not just because of the shooting with Keith Lamont Scott, but because of the history of this police department and the residents of Charlotte. And when you have the history that they have, a 20-year-old African-American man who was shot and killed by the police, a hung jury, you can't expect the community to just trust you. I think he's making a huge mistake, and if they want to end the protest, at least if they want to end the part of the protest that have become violent, he has to be willing to come forward and give the community more information. So when he talks about we have, the public doesn't have. And I think until the public feels like there is information that's being provided, there's transparency and accountability, we're not going to see any of the civil unrest that's happening in this city. We're not going to see an end to it.
Don,
ahead,
can I
Jeffrey.
give you an example of some, a story I covered a long time ago? Remember Amadou Diallo,
Yeah.
who was shot 41 times by the New York City police officers in the Bronx, you know, this famous Bruce Springsteen song about it now. There was a lot of suspicion and a lot of anger in New York about his death. Well, there was a trial of the 4 police officers who were involved. It was moved up to Albany, but it was televised. And everybody got to see the evidence in the case. And the evidence in the case was actually pretty favorable towards the 4 officers who were acquitted. But because everyone got to see the evidence and everyone got to see the officer's testimony and see the fullness of the story, there was not a lot of outrage in New York. And there was certainly no civil disobedience after the verdict in that case, because I think people are intelligent. And if you give them facts, if you give them reasons, if you give them the full story, and the full story justifies what the police did, they'll believe you. The problem here is that the Charlotte Police Department is saying, you know, we were fine, trust us, we've seen the evidence, but you can't see it. No one is going to believe that.
Let's talk about the gun, right? This apparent gun or alleged gun that he's said to have. The family says that it was a book. Police officers are saying, obviously you heard the police chief there saying, you know, it appears that their initial story was accurate, that he was brandishing a gun in some way. This picture is believed to be the gun that he was carrying. Again, I should say alleged to be, because it has not been established 100% that he was carrying a gun. So when you look at this as an open carry state, and Areva, you look at the circumstances surrounding this. I asked his attorney earlier if he had a license to carry. He said he didn't know at this particular time. So how does all of this play out?
Well, the gun's going to be really important in this case, Don. First of all, we have the family disputing the fact that Keith Scott had a gun. As you said, they said he had a book in his hand and that was his pattern, to sit in his car and read a book. They don't know anything about a gun. So again, the family nor does the public believe that a gun was involved. So questions have to be answered about the ballistics on that gun. Is this a gun that belonged to Keith Scott? Was it a gun that he had? Did he get out of his car with a gun? Did he fail to follow the commands of the police officer that shot him with respect to the gun? The mere fact that he had a gun in an open carry state is not enough to justify this shooting. We need to know, what did he do with that gun? Did he do anything to cause this police officer to reasonably believe that his life was in danger, or the lives of others who may have been in that vicinity? And that question has not been answered, and that is one of the pivotal questions that has to be answered before we can determine whether this shooting was indeed justified, as the police chief continues to state.
So it all, Jeffrey, it all hinges, I would think, it hinges on that videotape, if there was indeed a gun. Everything hinges on this tape, at least what we know now.
Well, I wouldn't say everything. These videotapes are not always dispositive. They don't always settle all the questions. What you need to do is a thorough investigation. Obviously, the videotape is a big part of it, but it's not the only part. How many witnesses were there? Who saw this? What is the ballistics evidence? How far away was the officer when the shooting took place? Were there other security cameras in the area? We live in a time where there are security cameras everywhere. I mean, you have to do a full, thorough investigation before you can draw any conclusions. But when you do have something as clear as a videotape of the incident, to let some people see it and make representations about it that the public is definitely not going to believe, that is no way to quiet people's concerns.
And to your point earlier, had the video, did you want to say something quickly, Areva?
Yeah, I just want to say, it just doesn't seem like the Charlotte Police Department learned anything from what happened in Ferguson. Everything that we witnessed in Ferguson about, the lack of transparency seems to be playing out in Charlotte. So it's not surprising that the community is outraged, and it's not surprising that we see the protests. It just doesn't seem like we've made any progress since Ferguson as we look at what's unfolding in Charlotte.
Mm-hmm. And again, this may not have happened if he had seen the video, whether the video shows him brandishing a gun or a book or what have you. This may not have happened because people at least may have seen for themselves exactly what went on. Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, Areva.
Thanks, Don.
This is CNN Breaking News.
All right, here we go. It is indeed right now midnight Eastern Time in the city of Charlotte, obviously. And there is a curfew that is taking effect right now, and there are still people on the street. This is CNN Tonight. I'm Don Lemon. The mayor of Charlotte has ordered a midnight to 6 a.m. curfew in hope of keeping her city calm in the wake of 3 days, 3 nights of protest over this fatal police shooting of Keith Lamont Scott. And we are watching now to see what happens. We're seeing it unfold as you are. These shots are from, obviously, the helicopter there. There's no sound to them, but you still see people on the streets. We saw moments ago members of the National Guard at the ready. There they are there, getting ready to do whatever it is that they're going to do at this particular hour. Police officers of Charlotte also on the streets as well. With them, the protesters and with them, our correspondents and our camera people as well, and CNN personnel out on the street. So again, we're watching to see what happens with this curfew. The mayor and city officials have been very adamant that people must be off the streets at midnight till 6 a.m. And they said that this would stay in place for as long as there's a state of emergency. Of course, the governor calling for a state of emergency last night and speaking here on CNN, as well as the mayor. The mayor and the family, as well as other officials, viewing the videotape of the shooting and coming out with their particular explanations earlier today and earlier this evening. So again, as we watch these live pictures and people still congregating on the streets, I want to get now to CNN's Boris Sanchez, who's been out covering this for us. Boris, it is after midnight. The curfew is in full effect. What's happening?
The same that we've seen just about all night, Don. People continue to walk the streets of downtown Charlotte. They gathered back at the Omni Hotel for a few moments. They stopped there. There was some chanting. There were a lot of police officers in that area. And then they decided to start moving once again. They started coming down this way back to where we were with you just about 24 hours ago, where we saw some fires being set. The difference tonight, though, as we get closer to this corner, is that there are National Guard vehicles, Humvees, parked along this street. Those were not there last night. We also have seen heavily armed National Guard. You see them right there, right across the street in that parking lot. They are all over this area. So far, they have stayed away from these protesters, but they are watching. And we've seen, as you saw in the past hour, protesters go up to them and shake hands with them and thank them for trying to keep the peace and maintain the calm in this city. Right now, the crowd is turning to the right back on East Trade Street. To the left of us is the police station, kind of to give you an idea of where we are right now. We've gone in 3 or 4 loops in the city of Charlotte. And as we turn right here, we saw, again, heavily armed National Guard over to this area just a few moments ago. We also saw a large contingent of police officers by a bus station and further down the street. So I'm not sure if they've perhaps set up some kind of barricade over there. It looked like they were getting ready to mobilize. Just down the street, less than 20 minutes ago, there were 2 large Charlotte Fire Department vehicles that were packed with law enforcement officials. They've since moved out of there, but it looked like they were about to get out and start moving when they had congregated, when the protesters had congregated by the police station. And as we continue moving down the street, I'm interested in seeing how these folks interact with the National Guard. And again, if there is a barricade at the end of the street, I should tell you also, Don, it actually started raining down on us at one point, and that didn't slow them down at all. They kept walking straight through the rain, again, making several loops around the city. As you said, you know, we're 5 minutes past midnight. A lot of the crowd has dissipated, but this is a growing crowd. We've seen people that were in other areas start getting closer and closer together. The chants have slowed down at this point, so there isn't that kind of unified voice. But as we walk closer, from the looks of it now, it's hard to tell, but I don't see this crowd stopping. I don't see a barricade in front of them. At around this time last night, there was a huge line of police in riot gear that had moved forward further and further down this block, forcing these folks out of here, forcing the crowd to disperse with tear gas and flashbangs and non-lethal munitions, rubber bullets. I can't really tell if they're stopping or not right now, but this crowd, I can tell you, is massive. And this is what I wanted to find out right here, Don, how these crowds are interacting with the National Guard. It looks like some people are just standing in front of them, videoing them. Other folks are going up and shaking hands, as I said before, thanking them. It's something that we've seen all night. But, you know, things can change very, very quickly, very rapidly. And one of the things that I've also noticed since we've been out here, Don, there are some people that, you know, walk up to these servicemen and shake their hands, and then there are some people that are wearing masks and yelling, you know, don't love them, don't hug them, they're not with us. So again, the situation unfolding here as we continue moving down the street, we're going to try to get a clearer picture of how police are going to handle this. Are they going to enforce that midnight curfew that was put on by the mayor of Charlotte? At this point, it doesn't look like police are really mobilizing any kind of effort to directly challenge this large crowd of protesters that continues moving down the street, Don.
Just want to thank you. Boris, stand by. I just want to alert our viewers that, of course, that curfew is not for members of the working press. They are exempt from that, and that's why we're out there. I'm wondering, though, working on getting some clarification, I wonder if these protests remain peaceful, if police and the National Guard would, rather than upset the apple cart, would just allow them to continue to protest peacefully. Let's get to CNN's Brian Todd. He's out there amongst the crowd at street level. So Brian, it's midnight. After midnight, you're on. What's happening where you are? Is anyone trying to enforce the curfew, and are people abiding by it?
Don, people are not abiding by it right now. We had a group of protesters come and shake hands with these National Guardsmen here. Some of them filmed them, but we also have some bicycle riding policemen right here. We're going to start to move with them as we start to follow the protesters again back into the uptown area where they've been so active all night long. You know, the police chief, Kurt Putney, has said that they would be very assertive in moving in on these situations and breaking people up and arresting them when there are heated moments and situations where they needed to intervene. This is seemingly one of them as we've passed midnight, as you said. And the crowd has been very, very tense. They've lost really none of their energy as long as we've been walking with them tonight. There are hundreds of them just over my shoulder here as we move further toward them up here. They seem to have possibly stopped up here on the hill on the incline going up here. We're on Trade Street going past the bus station here. But again, you know, this crowd on and off has been angry. It's been very passionate, and they have actually de-escalated situations on their own with no help from law enforcement. We did witness one confrontation where they came up to a man who was carrying a long rifle. He was not a policeman. He was not a National Guardsman. We think he might have been some kind of a private security contractor, but he was in military-style garb, and he was carrying a long gun, and it upset this crowd. They came up to him and were angry. They asked him why he was carrying that gun. He did not engage with them at all. He just kind of walked away, and we noticed that he put away his gun. But that crowd did not escalate it past that point. They have been, at some instances, Don, kind of policing themselves. That's the point I'm trying to make here. So, you know, right now, they are past the point of curfew. This is going to be another test for them to see how they react to the police when the police move in, and of course how the police do this. Because again, the chief has said that they would be more assertive than they have been the last couple of nights. So now that the crucial moment is at hand, as I try to move past this vehicle here, we're going to see how the police move in. But this crowd actually, this is a challenge for police as well, because this crowd has really not stood still for very long. We've been walking for blocks and blocks and blocks with them, really miles all night long. They've stopped in front of the jailhouse 3 times. They've stopped in front of the police station at least twice, and they laid down as if they were shot. They made a point of doing that. They've confronted officers, but not physically. They've confronted them verbally and yelled at them. But again, they have policed themselves. They have kept moving. They have moved with some measure of discipline, I think. But, you know, again, this is going to be a test in the coming moments. We're coming upon an area up here that seems to be active. They do stop on occasion and block intersections, and they give speeches, and they do some chanting and some other things like that. So we're going to see again if they're doing it up here, but they do seem to be moving. And one of their leaders I talked to a short time ago, he was really one of the ones who was instrumental in getting them to keep moving. He came up to them when they were really very active at the police station, when they were all lying down and they were standing up and yelling and chanting. He was the one who said, let's all move away from here. Let's get away from here because the police are going to move in on us here. So they have a sense, Don, of the police being around and possibly moving on them right about now after curfew. Yeah. Here's a line of National Guardsmen that the crowd has just moved past. So again, some potentially very tense moments ahead, Don.
So, Brian, you know, it's interesting, again, and we're working on getting some clarification because the National Guard is just standing there. You can see some of the protesters and some of the people on the streets shaking their hands. And there are Charlotte police officers, Mecklenburg police officers out there as well, not moving any of these protesters. And I'm thinking, the thinking would be, to any person who is being logical about this, is the decision has been made not to move in on these protesters as long as they remain peaceful at this point, and that appears to be what's happening, because otherwise they would be trying to get these people off the streets as soon as possible. Brian, I don't know if you see any police brass or any members of law enforcement that you can speak to get some clarification. But go on, Brian.
I will try to get that clarification, Don,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
There's one of the officers up here who's been kind of engaging with the crowd at various points of the night. I'll stop and try to talk to him.
Why don't you talk to him, and I'm going to go to CNN's Ed Lavandera, and then we'll get to Ed, and you go check that out and then get back to me. CNN's Ed Lavandera joining us out from Charlotte as well. Ed, where are you, and what are you seeing?
Well, we are at the intersection where this march really tonight started. This was the intersection where they had been congregating and essentially shut down the intersection for some time several hours ago. If you can look off into the distance here, as this line of marchers has come by steadily for the last few minutes. But if you look one block off that way, you can see where police officers have cordoned off the traffic, not letting them come through this particular intersection. And then if we turn back around this way, you can also see that they've done a similar thing here. And we've seen officers moving throughout the downtown streets like this as following the crowd and kind of keeping traffic controlled. So you have a group of National Guard soldiers over there, as well as police officers blocking off what little traffic is left here in the downtown streets. But, you know, we are now past the curfew time, and there have been no calls of telling people about the curfew, urging them to go home at this point. So we'll have to see exactly what the game plan will be here for the officers on the streets, exactly how they're going to enforce the curfew and what that will entail. So they're going to keep moving around. And as we talked several hours ago, that the officers seemed content as people were moving. But now that we're past the curfew, I haven't really seen any officers engaging with this line of protesters that have come by through this area where they have repeatedly come through throughout the evening, Don.
Yeah, and you know, just to be clear, Ed Lavandera, the National Guard will try as much as they can not to become engaged with this and just sort of protect the homes and businesses and the people there, and not become engaged in getting people off the street. That is the job of the Charlotte police. But again, it is nearly 15 minutes into the midnight hour, and there are still, you know, as you can see, hundreds of protesters are out in the street in Charlotte, and our correspondents are there as well. I want to bring in now, thank you, Ed, we'll get back to you. I want to bring in now CNN's Bakari Sellers. He's a political commentator and a former member of the South Carolina House of Representatives. Dimitri Roberts is a former Chicago police officer. CNN law enforcement analyst Cedric Alexander, Jeff Rueda of the St. Louis Police Officers Association, and Neil Franklin, a retired Maryland State Police major. So let's talk, who is best? It's probably either Neil or Cedric who can talk to this about the bigger picture here. I'm wondering if there has been a decision made not to engage the protesters as long as they remain peaceful. First Cedric and then Neil.
Well, that's what I believe is going to take place here, and is taking place, Don, is that they're not going to provoke anything. They're peaceful. And here shortly, they're probably going to break up anyway and begin to go home. And that's probably the best way to do it. They have a curfew set, but it's really no need to engage unnecessarily if they're peaceful at this point. But maybe it's a good thing that they put it in place. A lot of people did leave, but I think what they're going to have to do tomorrow night is make sure that they get the message out that at midnight the curfew comes into effect. Because if they weren't notified until 9:45, a lot of people just don't know. But I think police are playing it very cleverly here tonight.
Neil?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is similar to Baltimore. As long as the crowd continues to move, I'm sure the police are monitoring the numbers. As long as the numbers continue to thin out and the crowd moves, like Cedric said, the police aren't going to engage. That's my guess at this. As long as there's no violence, as long as there's no aggression, you're going to see the crowd continue to thin. The police are going to allow that to happen. And before you know it, we'll be at a situation where there's no longer a factor.
Jeff, what are your impressions on how police are handling this so far?
No, I agree with Neil and Cedric. You don't use a curfew to provoke things. You use it to diffuse things. But let me comment a little bit down on our experience in Ferguson. When the first night that they used curfews in Ferguson, It was one of the most peaceful nights in the 18 days that followed Michael Brown's death. And then the next night was one of the worst. So you got to remember that protesters, when they are bent on violence, adjust to police tactics pretty quickly.
Okay, go on, say again.
You still on me, Don?
Yeah, go ahead. What did you say, Jeff?
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Yeah, the protesters can really adjust quickly to law enforcement tactics. And even though we got a peaceful night, the first night of the curfew here in Charlotte, just as we did the first night of curfews in Ferguson, the second night in Ferguson got really, really ugly of the curfews. And law enforcement just has to continually modify and monitor their tactics.
Mm-hmm. Dimitri, what are you noticing in terms of changes in policing tonight? National Guard is out mobilized. You see a huge presence out there. We're seeing more officers on the streets, and again, not engaging with these protesters. And you see some protesters actually shaking the hands of the National Guards and Guardsmen and thanking them.
Well, those protesters are doing what the police should be doing. The police should be, while there's peaceful protests going on, they should be out shaking hands with those peaceful protesters that are out doing what they're supposed to at this hour. I understand that there's a curfew in place, but a further deployment of those resources should be being proactive amongst engaging these community members. Now, this is where you have an opportunity to engage the community, allow them to have a voice, even if it's one conversation, allow them to be heard, allow that dialogue to start happening. And now you can start to be proactive around getting ahead of what may happen tomorrow, getting the policy, getting the word out, and enabling those community members to now take matters into their own hands. Like the reporter said earlier, when a protester showed up with a weapon to the protest, those protesters handled that appropriately and they did it effectively. But now the police have to be proactive in the same way some of those protesters are.
Okay, I want you guys just to stand by for a minute. Do we have Brian Todd? Is Brian Todd there? Okay. So as I understand that Brian Todd is speaking with police, getting information now as we're speaking to try to report to us exactly what's going on here, and we should have that in moments from Brian Todd. But again, these are people who are still out on the streets at almost 20 minutes into the midnight hour, where they were told that they had to be off the streets or they would be arrested. A mandatory curfew signed and put into place by the mayor of Charleston, and also a state of emergency from the governor placed on North Carolina, at least on Charlotte, I should say, excuse me, on Charlotte last evening. So again, as we watch these pictures and we wait for Brian Todd's reporting, and you can, in one of the camera angles that I can see from here, I can see Brian speaking to police now, and as soon as Brian gets that information, we will get him on the air live. So just stand by for that. Back now to my panel. Bakari, are you there?
Yes.
Okay. So Bakari, tell me what's going on, because you were out on the streets this evening. Again, this appears, by all accounts, obviously much more peaceful than it was last night. The only incident that I can report to you that I know about at this moment is that 2 Charlotte-Mecklenburg police officers being treated by the EMS after being sprayed with a chemical agent by protesters during the unrest happening tonight. Minor incident compared to last night, Bakari.
Well, yeah, tonight was a peaceful protest. Tonight was a lesson in civil disobedience. Tonight were a bunch of young people, a bunch of clergy, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, everyone was coming together. Voicing their anger and their frustration. But there's a lot of distrust, Don, and I heard it earlier in your segment with Jeffrey Toobin. But it's a lot of distrust of the police. It's a lot of distrust of the government, and it seems as if it's only one side here. It seems as if the police, well, just speaking of the chief, is not being transparent, is not making this any easier whatsoever, because people just want justice. They just want to know what's going on. I mean, this is 3 years since Jonathan Ferrell was killed, and then had a hung jury here. So this is still a very open wound.
Bakari, I need you to stand by. I need to get to CNN's Brian Todd. Brian, what do you have for us?
I just heard Church Street. Don, I'm here with Captain Mike Campagna of the Charlotte Police. He has been observing the scene and supervising some officers here and kind of engaging with the crowd as they've moved along. Captain, first I want to ask you the question everybody's asking now. Why, after midnight, have the police not moved in and forcibly removed some of the marchers here?
It's just not been necessary. It's been a very peaceful group tonight. There's been a lot of people inside the group that have been helping to make that happen, helping to just pull people away from the aggressors standing between. This gentleman here has been working with us very hard and from the inside, and they're doing the lion's share of the work. That's what's helping us be peaceful. And the curfew's there, but we can use it as a tool if necessary, if things go sideways, and hopefully that just won't be the case.
I mean, do you anticipate moving in on them at any point between now and 6 a.m.?
Hopefully it won't be necessary, and hopefully that we can just continue to be peaceful. That's what we're about.
What are some of the things that people in the crowd have done to mitigate potential tension here?
So they, they're talking people down. They're trying to get between the officers and some of the more aggressive people. They're helping people make good decisions about what they do while they're out here on the streets.
Had you worked with some of those people before to ask them to do it?
Well, we didn't ask them to do it. They saw the need and they came out and met that need after what we had last night. So, yeah, it was something that they as a community said, this is important to us. We want to do this right, and they came out and made it happen.
What's your biggest concern going forward this evening and possibly tomorrow and beyond?
Well, it's always always a concern if things get out of hand. We don't want that to happen. So I've got to go find my protest.
We're live on WC.
Don,
one question about this.
That'll pretty much wrap it. The other reporters came upon us here, but very interesting. The police telling us now that they do not necessarily plan to move these people off the street unless they get violent, unless they get out of hand. And another very interesting development that the captain talked about, just how much they're being helped tonight by people inside the crowds. And we've seen it ourselves, some community activists and others, really coming between demonstrators and lines of police to mitigate some of the tension.
Yeah. We asked for it, and Brian Todd got it for us. Brian, thank you. Great reporting out there. Brian Todd on the streets, getting the confirmation, as we had suspected here, back to my panel that if it remained peaceful, that they could continue to protest and continue to stay on the streets. You heard the police, I believe it was a captain there, saying that, they're using this as a tool, Jeff Rueda, to get the people in order so that they would remain peaceful and not start looting and rioting as they did last night. Effective?
Very effective. We saw it used in a very effective manner here in St. Louis and Ferguson. I'm sure Neil will say the same thing about Baltimore. When people step up in the crowd that have peaceful intentions, and call out the bad behavior, I mean, it completely changes the dynamic of the crowd. It tamps down that mob mentality, and you can see an almost like a light switch being thrown, an almost instant change in the crowd when you've got people inside who are respected, members of the community, and have been out there marching with folks. Call out bad behavior.
And Bakari, you were mentioning that before I so rudely interrupted you. Sorry, I had to get to Brian Todd, but you were mentioning the people who were out there who were trying to sort of mitigate the violence and serve as buffers between the police officers and the protesters. And that appears to have worked.
And yes, and what you saw this group of pastors. I saw some from Billy Graham's church, and then I actually saw this captain that was speaking just a moment ago to Brian Todd, just sitting out here talking to a gentleman, and they were having a conversation. The young man was like, you need to make sure that you're talking to some of your white colleagues that are not in uniform. I mean, this is the conversation that we have to have. Unfortunately, I'm tired of saying Black Lives Matter. I'm tired of having to protest. We shouldn't have to protest. We shouldn't have to say Black Lives Matter. But this moment requires that. And there were so many young people out here tonight doing what John Lewis said, which is getting in good trouble. They're protesting, they're letting their voices be heard. But I anticipate this is going to go on until the leadership here in the city, until the mayor and the chief of police decide that they're going to open up, be transparent, and let everybody know what happened to this young black man who was killed a few nights ago.
All right. Stand by, everyone. When we come right back, much more in our breaking news. The city of Charlotte under a mandatory curfew until 6 a.m., but protesters still out on the street, and police say they have no plans to enforce the curfew if everything stays peaceful. We'll be right back.